Hello, I'm Michael Pierce, and this is The Human Condition. Today we're talking about what can we do to help friends and loved ones with PTSD. The most important thing is to identify that there is something going on, and talking to them about the difference between coping with PTSD, or any condition really, and resolution of the condition is the key. When a person begins to understand that they have a problem, they first cope with it, and then they try to resolve it in an ideal way. If you cope with something forever, you never really resolve it, never really deal with it, never really solve it and get it under control and get it behind you. And my belief is that everyone should start with the idea that we can get the problem behind them at some point. Even amputees and people that have very difficult problems can get to the point where their problem is largely behind them. So I want to address the idea that resolution is the concept of getting the problem behind you someday and visualizing that you might actually get it resolved or get it behind you or get it cured or get it done with one way or the other. Whether you still have remnants of the disease like in an amputee or you don't. The idea of coping, on the other hand, is not a wrong idea. It's just an idea that has a certain time frame. And ideally, that would be based on when you're in a crisis. So if you're traveling through the mountainside on foot, you have to cope with an injury until you can resolve it. You can't treat it the same way. Soldiers in the battlefield have to cope with injuries. They can't heal and resolve their injuries. In fact, sometimes they have to make their injuries worse to get through the battle. So that happens to all of us to some degree and at some level where we're in coping mode and we switch over to resolution mode. With PTSD, coping would include first of all, identifying that they have some kind of PTSD, and that means asking people questions like, have you behaved differently since a certain stressor has happened to you? And if you have behaved differently, how have you behaved differently? Do you act differently in public? Do you act differently in private? Do you have moments of psychological breakdown where you can't handle things, either in private or after an event, or during an event, or in public? Do you have triggers that are out in the world or at home that trigger you to experience and re-experience and relive a traumatic event? Do you have reliving of traumatic events and flashbacks in your sleep or when you are alone or when you're idle or tired? So those are ways we can help people with PTSD, is try to talk to them and ask them to learn to identify that they might have it. Many people could be in denial, especially soldiers are often in denial that they might have a PTSD, and realize that PTSD isn't usually permanent. It can be, but it's not usually permanent. And earlier when I talked in our previous lecture about PTSD's effects on the brain, long-term effects of PTSD can start to look like concussions when you look at the brain and you examine it. In fact, you've heard of CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is a disease that's only identified on autopsy. We can't really identify it easily with MRI and QEEG fully. We can see some of the effects of it, but you can't make a full diagnosis without taking a sample of the brain and looking at it under a microscope at this point. And so CTE is something that can develop from repeated traumas to the brain. It used to be called the boxer's disease. So a person that has PTSD, their brain can tend to resemble someone with repeated boxer's trauma or repeated concussions. But that takes a long time and a lot of repeated concussions to happen. So if you think about how many repeated concussions might happen to a sports person compared to how many emotional traumas might happen to a person with PTSD, to be equal, you'd have to have a lot of emotional trauma repeatedly. And certainly some do. But it's less likely that a person's going to have as many discrete incidents of trauma that are emotional as they would physical if they were an athlete, like a boxer that has, fought innumerable fights and taken innumerable punches to the head. But it is possible that people can experience almost constant, unrelenting traumas throughout their childhood, which is worse, and especially in childhood, but also in adulthood. They could undergo repeated traumas over and over and over again, and that would be the type of thing that could lead to the worst types of outcomes. But again, there's still hope for all of these folks, and one of the things you can do is help to shield them from triggers. You can help to shield them from loud noises. You can help to shield them from violent events and commercials that might have horror movies or zombie movies or war movies. You might try to shield them from traffic. You might try to give them sunglasses and dark glasses and things that shield their eyes and ears from lots of light and sound. Often these patients are light and sound sensitive because of other difficulties that happen. They do well with earplugs sometimes. Certain soldiers, though, will not do well with earplugs because they need to be tuned into their environment. So in some cases, a person with PTSD does well to do sensory deprivation, and that helps the average civilian shut down. But for a military person, often they need to be more aware. And if they can be more aware, they feel better. So wide open spaces are good for those types of soldiers. Places where they can't be snuck up on, places where there's not a lot of places to hide, places where they feel like they have a good field of view and they have enough room to defend themselves and protect themselves. Making sure that they feel safe and that they have enough food, that they have enough water, they have enough supplies, that they have enough, well, in some cases, quite frankly, ammunition. It's a real factor for some people. And sometimes it's a false sense of security, but sometimes it's actually very helpful for them to feel like they have the stuff they need to feel safe. That might mean, in some cases, wearing a flak jacket or some kind of armor. It might mean for them to have a door that locks, or to have windows that lock, or to have an alarm system. But some soldiers will want to live with people that they trust. Others will want to live alone. Some will want to be near family members to protect family members. And it all depends on whether the family members are highly trained or not highly trained. A soldier will treat a family member that's not trained differently than they'll treat comrades in arms who are well trained, because they have a different level of standard for knowing who can do what in an experience where there's a threat. So it's a little complex to figure out the best way to cope, and you have to tailor it to the individual with PTSD. The QEGs for PTSD can look a lot like the QEGs for brain trauma, for mild traumatic brain injury, or post-concussion syndrome, or traumatic brain injury. You can see areas of impact, and you can see areas of chronic underfiring or overfiring of different brain waves. You can see problems with slow waves and problems with amplitude or power of the output of the brain's voltage. And you can also see problems with connectivity and coherence, which is how different brain areas communicate with each other. And so instead of just looking at one area and one brain wave and how much amplitude it pushes out, we're also looking at coherence, which is how much does it communicate with another brain area across the brain and in front and behind and right next to it. So those communication pathways are really important. So these are some simple ways that you can pay attention to and help a person with PTSD. I think I'll end on the most important one, which is really common: dehydration and hypoglycemia. My biggest problem with my soldiers is that they have mineral deficiencies, because when you're under stress, you pee out your minerals and you lose your electrolyte balance and you become dehydrated easier, and then you can't stabilize your blood sugar and you can't fast for very long. So they'll report that in the field they could fast for days and days, and then when they come back they can't fast and their blood sugar goes up and down, and they're not used to that. And so they have much worse PTSD because of unstable blood sugar. So these patients need minerals, they need fats, they need steady blood sugar, and that will help them be less susceptible to the ravages of PTSD.